Hello everyone, and welcome to this further presentation by the London Transport Museum Friends. Our speaker at this presentation is Matt Brosnan, the head curator at London Transport Museum. Whilst many of his colleagues sadly recently have been away from the office on furlough, Matt and a small team of his colleagues have been working hard to both design and to deliver a new exhibition at the museum, which is London's Transport at War. And it is that exhibition which is the subject of Matt's talk. Before I hand over to Matt, can I just say that if you're watching this in our live premiere, you will be able, if all goes well, to engage with Matt by using the chat button, because he'll be live at that very first presentation. But if you're watching after that, you can still leave a comment, and please do, because we welcome feedback on both our presentations generally and on the specific topic we're covering. So with that introduction done, I'll hand over to Matt.
Hello, I'm Matt. As Barry said, the head curator at London Transport Museum. So I have the great pleasure of overseeing the team that look after the fantastic collection that we have, numbering about 500,000 objects in total. And as Barry said, that one of the most recent projects we've been engaged with, including throughout the lockdown, actually the recent lockdown, has been the London's Transport at War Gallery, which has been in development for a little while now, and actually was about a week into its build before lockdown came in, which paused things slightly, but it is very much back on track, and we're really looking forward to it opening around about mid-October, so in about a month's time from now. The objects themselves are actually about to go in over the next few weeks, so it's a really exciting sort of last run before it's actually ready to go for the public, and for hopefully for all of you to visit it in the flesh when the time allows. But today I'm going to talk about both the design and the approach to the new gallery, and also the content within it and how that is structured and how we've dealt with the narrative of what is a really fascinating aspect of London Transport's history and the wider history of the city, and how that is related to the wider implications of both the First World War and the Second World War. So I have some slides to talk through to illustrate this fantastic new gallery. And as I say, it's called the London's Transport at War Gallery, subtitled Seeing It Through, both because that was the title of a series of posters produced by London Transport, working with the artist Eric Kennington during the Second World War, of which the example you can see there is one. And also because Seeing It Through seems to sum up the process of this project in the difficulties and challenges of this year, and also obviously the reflective nature of the two periods that we're looking at with this gallery, the two world wars, obviously periods of intense social upheaval, loss of life, and massive civilian and military effort to see through two monumental conflicts. And this new gallery is something that is replacing an old version in the permanent narrative at the museum in Covent Garden. And one of the things that we really wanted to do with a new gallery was to make this this topic, which is so fascinating and so rich and so meaningful, more reflected in the look and feel of the space itself. It's quite a small gallery, so it has quite a lot to cover in a relatively small footprint. But importantly, one of the aspects that we wanted to improve upon was the actual exterior of the gallery. These two photographs show what the gallery looked like before the redevelopment began. It had a slightly muted colour and appearance, lots of tones of grey, and it tended to result in visitors not always entering the space. If they did, they wouldn't necessarily linger there for more than a couple of minutes. Many visitors actually would explore the bell shelter that you can see on the left-hand side of that photograph, and then would actually not necessarily go into the gallery proper. So it's something that we really wanted to address with a new design, a refreshed content and refreshed offer. Inside the gallery itself, the previous version had a fairly sort of muted clinical feel. So strip lighting, which wasn't the best lighting that could be used, a fairly flat two-dimensional display with a lot of wall-mounted, quite shallow cases, not offering necessarily the full kind of, sort of sharing of content in the best displayed way that we could potentially use. And also quite a text-heavy approach. So as you can see with the left-hand image in particular, there's quite a lot of text in quite a small condensed area. So again, something that we wanted to address by revisiting the narrative and simplifying the narrative to make it as engaging and understandable as possible to all of our visitors and audiences. And also it's, as I say, a fairly constrained space, not the biggest space. And at the back of the gallery is a very small area, which evokes, in the previous version, a kind of tube station platform with a kind of painted scenic approach. We have to retain the physical structure, so that area is still a small space, but we've taken a slightly more modern approach to how it appears and have used it and the constraints of the space to really emphasize an audio-visual display, which will be a big feature of the whole gallery and actually will provide quite a lot of the audio to the space. Again, one of the issues with the previous gallery was that we had a bit of audio clash between two different audio elements in the space. So you would often get different bits of audio footage interrupting and playing over the top of each other, whereas in the new gallery, you'll have one single audio feature that will help to provide atmosphere to the whole of the space. This is an artistic impression by our designers of the exterior of the gallery. So it's, as you can see, quite a different approach, one that has a real bold use of colour in the use of the yellow to create a sense of a kind of artistic impression of a searchlight beam, obviously such a evocative image of especially the Second World War and the Blitz in particular. But the exterior gives a kind of visual impression of the exterior of a tube station, a kind of Charles Holden style design tube station, so that you get a sense of the bell shelter in the kind of context that they were actually used as a kind of quick shelter for London Transport staff that were caught during an air raid on a London Transport site, so that they could duck in there for a bit of hasty shelter in the event of an air raid. And the graphic approach will obviously emphasise the fact that stations and London Transport sites were subject to bomb damage and the kind of destructive effect of Zeppelin raids in the First World War, and then obviously long-range bomber aircraft in the Second World War. And actually the build is now progressed to the point where this exterior has actually been realised, so it does look very much like the design impression that you see here, and one that also importantly merges nicely with the Future Engineers Gallery that's immediately next door. So that was redeveloped very recently and is a very colourful space, very lively space. So importantly, the War Gallery had to compete with that and had to really be able to sit alongside that and stand successfully alongside it, so that visitors would engage in both spaces and not just one or the other. Another aspect of what we're achieving, I think, with the new gallery is a much more interactive space. So a key feature in the new offer as you enter the gallery is an interactive table in the center of the space. So this is a really sort of visually exciting three-dimensional offer that incorporates showcases with objects from our collection and also interactive elements. So as you enter the space, there will be an interactive that allows you to take inspiration from the kind of tickets that were issued to civilians who were sheltering in tube stations during wartime. So especially for younger visitors, they'll be able to kind of create their own using a kind of brass rubbing interactive. There'll also be an interactive featuring a steering wheel from our collection, a bus steering wheel, an example of First World War trench art that's engraved with language and phrases associated with the service of an Army Service Corps unit during the First World War, one of the many units that used repurposed London buses for military use, particularly on the Western Front. And the bus steering wheel will be incorporated into an interactive so that you can actually manipulate it and learn a bit more about the specific phrases and details that are featured on the spokes of the steering wheel. So it's a really nice, interesting aspect of how to display an object. There's also going to be a digital touch screen that reveals the individual stories of women that worked for the Metropolitan Railway during the First World War, bringing those stories to life with a lovely bit of animation, as well as the entries relating to their individual stories that were contained in staff registers from the time that are also part of our collection. There'll also be an interactive that allows especially younger visitors to manipulate rotating blocks to form artistic impressions of different roles that were performed by London Transport staff, both men and women, during the two World Wars. And there, as I say, will also be objects on display relating to typical wartime experience, including a gas mask, a London Transport issue, steel helmet, a lovely little lamp that was used by a bus conductor during the Second World War to identify the tickets and change that he was giving to passengers as they were boarding his bus. So it's a really lovely offer in the centre of the space that I think will appeal to a range of different visitors. Another important aspect of the new gallery is being able to display our objects to better advantage in a way that is visually more appealing than the old gallery. So we'll have several sort of more three-dimensional acrylic box showcases that will allow objects to be mounted in a slightly more visually interesting way than they were before. And this will be a key feature of the space as you look at it. In keeping with that, we will be including several personal stories relating to individuals who experienced the two World Wars in different ways. And again, those stories will be explored through objects displayed in the best way we can. So, for example, we will have two stories relating to bus drivers during the First World War who both volunteered to accompany their buses and serve with them on the Western Front. And they will be displayed in showcases that have the look and feel of suitcases to give that extra bit of visual interest to how those objects are presented, and also how the story and the text and the captioning that relates to those items is displayed. And I mentioned as well the smaller space at the back of the gallery that really focuses on the sheltering story during the two World Wars. And instead of having the slightly dated painted walled approach that we had in the old gallery, instead there will be a much simpler, more modern scenic treatment that gives you the suggestion of a station platform environment, the kind of place where civilians were often bedding down for the night during wartime air raids. And with clever use of mirrors at either end, it will make the space feel a bit longer, a bit wider, and give you that sort of slightly false impression that you're in a bigger space than you are. But the key feature in this is the kind of projection that you can see on the back wall there. We've got a fantastic sort of AV feature that will really bring to life the atmosphere and the experience of what it was like for people to shelter in those spaces in both World Wars, the kind of threat that Zeppelin airships and long-range bomber aircraft presented to London and its transport network and the people that were living and working in the city at the time, and really kind of bringing to life that experience through the use of filmed interviews with eyewitnesses, archival footage, both from the First and Second World Wars, and images and stills as well. So that will be a really prominent feature of this space and of the gallery as a whole. I mean, it will also work both as a sort of feature piece, which will, hopefully visitors will watch and sit down and engage with for the 5 minutes duration that it runs. But then outside of that, there will also be atmospheric audio-visual footage that will provide a kind of visual and sound background to the whole gallery as you engage with it. So it will have a really useful dual purpose that I think will work really well for visitors. Now, talking about the narrative structure of the gallery, rather than the old approach that we had in the pre-existing gallery, which was chronological, which looked at the First World War and then the Second World War in turn, to help condense the space, to reduce the density of text, to make it more engaging. We decided to use a thematic narrative instead. So this allows us to look at both of the two world wars and compare and contrast between them, and not have to have that kind of very specific chronological focus that adds to the kind of density of the information that you're providing. So the first theme that the gallery looks at is going to war, this sense of mobilization for the war efforts in both world wars, the fact that London Transport and its predecessor companies very much mobilized with the wider nation to contribute to the war effort. And some of the content relating to this is obviously posters that you can see in front of you here. So the London Underground, just before the First World War, from about 1908, started to use pictorial posters in a big way through the influence of Frank Pick, who initially, when he joined the Underground group, was responsible for publicity. And by the First World War, pictorial posters were a vital part of what the Underground was doing to advertise itself and to advertise the transport network. And during the First World War, the Underground actually produced posters very, very quickly in wider support of the war effort. So the Frank Brangwyn design that you can see on the left is a really, really typical example of a First World War recruitment poster. And you'd be forgiven for thinking it was issued by the British government, but actually it was a London Underground commission, and one that was, very much symbolic of their contribution to the wider recruitment efforts in 1914. It's very typical of its time as well, in using very sort of stark imagery of the destructive impact of the German invasion through Belgium and into northern France, and really kind of pulling on the heartstrings by sort of emphasizing the terrible destructive effect on Belgian civilians to encourage British men to join the armed forces. The poster on the right-hand side is a kind of slightly different approach. It's a more sort of information-based poster using a kind of a template, so that you could use different photographs and different captions to advertise the progress of the war, whilst also putting recruitment messages alongside. And again, this is an Underground produced poster from 1915, so quite early in the First World War. Also in this topic, we look at the huge sort of effort to repurpose and requisition London buses for the war effort. About 1,000 of them were requisitioned by the British government for the war effort, in particular to transport troops from camps to the front lines on the Western Front, and as well as quite a variety of different uses, from mobile pigeon lofts to mobile workshops and ambulances, and also sometimes converted into lorries as well for logistical purposes. And we have obviously lovely content relating to this theme, including, as I mentioned earlier, the bus steering wheel that we're incorporating into a physical interactive that really kind of symbolizes that contribution of London buses and their drivers and crews, often volunteering to join the Army Service Corps, which was the kind of logistical branch of the British Army, where many of these bus drivers found themselves using their skills, their driving skills and their mechanical skills to be able to provide this support service that was so important. And as I mentioned, we have some personal stories relating to that topic. So we have Charles Lee, the mustachio chap at the bottom there. And we also have some audio footage from another London bus driver who worked as a mechanic and as a driver on the Western Front, Edward Darby, who's shown in the bottom right there. And you'll be able to listen to some interview footage with him on a handset on the wall in this part of the gallery, so that it doesn't clash with the rest of the audio-visual material that's on display. Also in this theme, we look at how buses and road vehicles were also repurposed during the Second World War. So in particular, T-type coaches were used as ambulances, so often still sporting their kind of green line liveries, being repurposed to evacuate vulnerable patients just before the start of the Second World War in August and September 1939. And some of them were also converted into mobile canteens, especially for American forces. So that, as you can see in the right-hand photograph there as well. So they were incredibly adaptable, and like the B-type buses and other buses have been repurposed in the First World War, some were also repurposed in the Second. And also a really fascinating and sometimes little known aspect of London Transport's contribution to the British war effort in the Second World War was the London Aircraft Production Group. This was a body of companies led by London Transport that basically manufactured Halifax bomber aircraft from the various components that were manufactured at different sites across London and the southeast, and then brought together at Leavesden Airfield, just north of London, and then finished off and used by the Royal Air Force in bombing operations during the Second World War. And we have a little cluster of content relating to that, including photographs and a lovely sort of ashtray that was given to Eric Ottaway, who was the managing director of the London Aircraft Production Group during the Second World War. So just a testament to how London Transport reused and repurposed its industrial skills and its workforce and its facilities specifically for a very much a military wartime purpose. The second main theme that the gallery looks at is called They Also Serve, and focuses on the role and the increasing role and variety of roles performed by women during both World Wars. Obviously, one of the big aspects that's mentioned in the first theme around recruitment and around men from society being asked to either volunteer or later to be conscripted for the armed forces. Women were often asked and actually proactively filled those roles that needed to be replaced. So about 18,000 women served with London's Transport in the First World War, and another 20,000 in the Second World War. And they performed a huge variety of roles, with a even greater variety in the Second World War. Ranging from public-facing roles as lift staff, as station staff, as ticket collectors, bus conductors, right through to kind of engineering and maintenance roles at bus depots in and around the capital. And they obviously did this, very, very willingly and proactively. And again, we have content relating to this topic and relating to specific individual women that perform these roles. So we have a fantastic London General Omnibus Company women bus conductors uniform, which will be displayed in a large showcase in the corner of the space. And this is the first time it's going to be on permanent display. It has been displayed temporarily before, but this will be now a permanent feature of the galleries. And we'll also focus on particular individual bus conductors, including Ellen Ballfield, who was one of the very first LGOC female bus conductors, and also one of the last to leave that service in November 1919. And also Florence Cordell, who again gave a fantastic interview to the museum many years ago, which you can listen to excerpts from in the new gallery. And it's important, obviously, to mention that women also performed a variety of roles during the Second World War. The photograph on the left shows women bus conductors finishing their training during the Second World War. And as I mentioned in describing the interactive table towards the beginning, we have a digital touchscreen focusing on the roles of women in the Metropolitan Railway during the First World War. And the register on the right-hand side is the actual item that inspired that interactive. So it's a handwritten, obviously large bound ledger, which you cannot really display to great advantage in its original form because it's a fantastic information resource, but you can't display more than 2 entries at a time. So it was something where we felt an interactive that allowed visitors to really explore the authentic object, but in a more artistic way, would be a fantastic feature for multiple different audiences. As I mentioned as well, the sheltering theme is probably the most famous thing you tend to associate London Transport with during wartime, especially during the Second World War. But we felt it was very important to emphasize that this was also a very prominent feature during the First World War. This is the very first conflict to see civilians being targeted by the use of air raids, initially by large airships, quite slow moving, cumbersome things, but scary nonetheless. And then towards the end of the First World War, the first long range bomber aircraft. And then later during the Second World War, through a whole array of different bomber aircraft that were much more destructive, both in numbers and in the kind of devices that they could drop on the city below. But as I say, this theme and topic is covered in the kind of smaller space at the back of the gallery, where the main form of sharing and talking about this theme is through the audio-visual presentation that people will be able to see on the back wall. But we wanted to also create a sense of that atmosphere with the space. So there is a few kind of examples of typical posters and notices that were displayed on the network during both World Wars, obviously advertising the fact that stations were open for sheltering purposes, and obviously emphasizing the importance of keeping blinds drawn and keeping blackout conditions to prevent German aircraft from being able to find easy targets. And obviously this was a quintessential experience for many Londoners and civilians that were in the city during both World Wars. It was a natural place to seek shelter from the incredible destruction that was being wreaked from above, and something that was a vivid experience for those that lived through it. So something that really was a key part of the story that we wanted to tell with this gallery. And then the fourth theme, which is quite a sort of sizable portion of the gallery, we've called Keeping London Moving. So obviously one of the key aspects of what London Transport was there to do during wartime was to keep that system functioning, so to be able to maintain the transport system in spite of all the massive challenges that were faced, not least from air raids. And so we cover quite a lot of different ground with the content in this section, from the role of the Home Guard that you can see in the top left. London Transport as a company actually recruited 7 battalions of the Home Guard during the Second World War, so troops that were made up of men who were either too young or too old to be conscripted in the full armed forces, or were in a reserved occupation sometimes as well. And the Home Guard was there to provide that element of extra security, particularly in the event of German invasion, which is obviously widely anticipated in 1940. And the London Transport Home Guard units in particular tended to guard and parade and give that extra sense of security to London Transport sites in and around the capital, from depots to garages to stations to all sorts of places. And even actually some London Transport Home Guard units were used to provide guard duty at Buckingham Palace as well. The poster underneath that, the Save Rubber poster by the designer Tom Eckersley, really emphasizes how wartime was a time of extreme, rationing and constriction and shortages, to the extent that London Transport produced its own posters for staff behind the scenes to make sure that they preserved things like the tyres on their buses that they were driving, through to paper and all the kind of resources that were necessary for wartime effort. And the top right photograph refers to the massive evacuation scheme in 1939 at the very beginning of the Second World War, which again London Transport was massively involved in providing the trams and the tube and the bus access to get thousands and thousands of civilians from different parts of London through to the mainline railway stations, where they could be evacuated to more rural locations up and down the country. And again, we make use of interview footage with a Second World War bus driver describing his experiences both in evacuating civilians at the very beginning of the Second World War up to Cambridgeshire, through to his experience of driving buses during air raids in central London. So it's a really sort of rich vein of content. Obviously, one of the main difficulties and challenges of working for the company and keeping the network going was being having to work during extremely dangerous circumstances and during the air raids of both world wars. On the left-hand side, there is a fantastic object and very sort of typical object of the First World War. It's actually a remnant of cabling and troughing from a First World War air raid, actually one of the heaviest air raids on London during the First World War. And it was very typical because of the relative novelty of air raids during that period to keep mementos and examples of the damage that resulted and mount them on a decorative plaque to really mark the significance of the event. And obviously, the Second World War saw even greater intensity air raids, particularly during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941. And the chap in the photograph and the helmet next to him, it relates to Vernon Robertson, who was the chief engineer of London Transport during the Second World War. And so the person that was ultimately responsible for a lot of the engineering and rebuilding that was required after the extensive air raids that were suffered by London during that conflict. And one of the very unfortunate aspects of that danger and the risks that staff faced was that some unfortunately paid the ultimate sacrifice for being on duty and for doing those roles in those circumstances. And we have a kind of a case study of that through the very large Elmer's End War Memorial that we have in the collection. This was on display in the previous incarnation of the gallery, and we're remounting it in a slightly different position in the new gallery. It felt always like this was a key object in the space, and one that symbolized the kind of threat and effort that London Transport staff provided during the Second World War in particular. So it marks the death of 10 staff at Elmer's End bus garage, which was hit by a V1 Doodlebug during 1944, when there was a renewed air offensive by Germany after the initial sort of flurry of the Blitz in 1940 and 41. There was a quieter period followed by an intense air offensive again towards the end of the Second World War, and that was when this unfortunate event took place. But obviously staff were often working in very central London locations during times when air raids were in progress, and this was unfortunately sometimes the end results. A key aspect as well of working in these circumstances was actually the kind of difficulty of day-to-day duty. So the dangers of air raids meant that at night time blackout conditions were utilised to make sure that German aircraft couldn't pick out easy navigable features of London through the light that they could see from buildings, from street lights, from traffic. So measures were taken, obviously blackout curtains in people's houses and flats, extinguishing street lights, but also things like putting hoods on the headlights of buses and painting the mudguards in bright white so that the civilians and passengers that were standing at the bus stop could just about pick them out as they were approaching. Civilians were also encouraged to wear white gloves and sometimes carry white handkerchiefs to be able to attract the attention of bus drivers when they were waiting at a bus stop. And London Transport staff themselves often improvised additional equipment. So the little lamp that you can see on the left-hand side was used by a bus conductor as something that he made himself to be able to check out the change that he was giving and the tickets that he was dispensing to passengers as he was doing his job as a conductor on the back of the bus. So really interesting little item that really kind of conjures up the atmosphere of wartime London and the topic that we're looking at. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, posters were a key aspect of what London Transport and its predecessor companies produced to advertise the network and to promote travel on the network in normal circumstances. But again, during the Second World War, the emphasis was very much on converting that poster effort into something that had more tangible benefit for the wider war effort. The left-hand poster from 1915 is quite a bizarre example, actually, using a kind of a weird sense of humor and a very distinctive sort of cartoon style of the Warbis brothers who designed it, saying, "Why bother about the Germans invading the country? Invade it yourself." So it's kind of encouraging visitors to largely ignore the war effort, whilst at the same time mentioning it. But that is actually quite an untypical example. Much more typical during most of the First World War, and particularly during the Second World War, were posters like the one in the centre by James Fitton, which very much emphasised the link between the home and the factory, and the fact that London Transport was providing that kind of mechanism to keep the war effort going and to allow workers to get to their munitions factories, or workers to get to their workplace to do the vital work that was required to keep the wheels of war moving. And also posters produced by London Transport and the Underground were vital in helping to boost and promote morale as well. So on the right hand side is an original artwork by the artist Walter Spradbury for a poster that he did in 1944 for London Transport, very much evoking this kind of typical symbolic image of London and its spirit and survival, with the depiction of St Paul's Cathedral surrounded by bomb-damaged remnants of the city. The cathedral itself obviously stood as a symbol during the Blitz, when there were famous photographs taken of it being shrouded in smoke and damage during massive air raids. But the fact that it miraculously survived was often used as a propaganda tool for representing the kind of Blitz spirit and courage of London and Britain as a nation. And this was obviously a very evocative image that was utilised successfully in this poster, which was part of a series called The Proud City that Walter Spradbury produced for London Transport, also depicting other very famous London landmarks. And I specifically also mentioned this artwork because it is one that we have had specifically conserved and framed for display using Friends funds to do so. So it's something that we are especially grateful to you for helping us to preserve it and display it to best effect, because it's an original artwork, so it has required that extra care and attention. And then finally, we have a small conclusion at the end of the gallery, which tries to draw together some of the threads of the end of conflict. It's called The Day Will Come, which is taken from another poster that we feature that relates to a quote from Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister during the Second World War. And obviously the end of both World Wars was a complex mix of different emotions, from grief and loss through to celebration and relief and pride and so on. And we have a photograph on the left of wounded rehabilitating servicemen who worked for the Underground Group being brought to the Royal Albert Hall for a celebratory event just after the First World War on London buses, obviously with a very receptive crowd cheering them on. And it just kind of represents how both the London Transport companies provided that kind of manpower that contributed to the military effort, but they also provided the workforce that kept the city functioning as well. And on the right-hand side, we have a photograph from 1946 from a victory parade that was held in the summer of that year, with two buses still complete in their wartime, I say livery, but they wartime sort of provision, in terms of they've still got their hooded headlights, their painted mudguards, and their anti-blast netting on the inside of the windows, given royal acknowledgement as they drive along. So again, really symbolising that contribution that London Transport provided during the Second World War. And a key aspect, I suppose, as well is remembrance. Both world wars have led to really sort of commonplace aspects of remembrance. Every year particularly in central London and on the Mall, Remembrance Sunday parades, of which Old Bill, a London bus, a B-type London bus, which is now in the IWM's collection, which we had on display at Covent Garden on loan for several years, was a key part of Remembrance Sunday processions for about 50 years. And even today, TfL is still one of the very few civilian organisations that takes part in Remembrance Sunday processions. And a key aspect, obviously, of everything that we associate with remembrance is derived from that kind of post-First World War context, which is obviously then incorporated the remembrance of those who lost their lives during the Second World War. But also here on display, we will have another original poster artwork by the artist Anna Zinkhuizen that's shown in the centre here. This is a poster that was commissioned by London Transport in 1944, anticipating the end of the war, obviously showing a kind of a young family looking to a more optimistic horizon in the distance, with the darker remnants of wartime experience kind of on the left-hand side and bottom of the image. And it's a very sort of evocative artwork of quite an artistic form of poster, that it clearly had very little to do with the transport network itself, but much more to do with morale and wartime experience as a whole. And on the right-hand side, we have a poster, Rehabilitation, which is again part of a series of posters commissioned by London Transport at the very end of the Second World War and immediately into the post-war years. And it really kind of typifies how the end of conflict is not just a sense of relief and moving on. There's also the kind of painful reality of having to rebuild and reconstruct, especially after the massive bomb damage of the Second World War, which had wrought a huge amount of destruction on the transport network. So stations and bus stops and garages and depots and track and all of the aspects of the network had to be extensively rebuilt and reconstructed, and something that was also taking place in economically challenging times with relatively little money and rationing still very much a part of civilian experience at the time. So whilst obviously the both world wars were met with a great deal of joy and relief, there was also the reality of the situation that obviously London Transport was very much engaged with in rebuilding. But that is essentially a quick run through the topic and the new gallery and some of the content that will feature. It will be open to the public in mid-October, and it should hopefully be something that the friends enjoy and find of interest. As I say, I am particularly grateful for the funding and the support that the friends have given us with this project. We have benefited from that, through as I say, the conservation of artworks and the provision of that we can really put to good use in the display itself. And it's a vital part of renewing and redeveloping our permanent gallery offer, which we've been doing for several years now. And this is just the latest corner of the galleries that will benefit from a refreshed look and feel, and hopefully something that will meet the aims that we set out for at the beginning of the project, to really engage visitors in this topic very thoroughly, and to bring it to life for a range of different age groups and different visitors. Yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I do hope that you can engage in the Q&A session that will be running, and ask me any questions that you want to.
Thanks, Matt. That's an excellent explanation of what's clearly going to be an excellent exhibition. I'm sure we're all going to have our own interesting individual things that we'll find to relate to, but I just love the way that some of those personal stories are going to be used to draw out the wider narrative. So congratulations from the friends, at least to all the people and your colleagues who've been involved in the work that's delivered that museum. We look forward to seeing it, and as Matt says, that should be possible from mid-October. Remember, please, at the moment at least, and I suspect for quite a while to come, you do need to pre-book a slot to visit the museum, but that's quite easily done online, and I hope many of the friends and indeed our YouTube viewers will do that. So in thanking Matt once again, can I thank you, YouTube viewers, for watching. Do please comment. If you've missed the live Q&As, you can still leave a comment, and we'll be looking at those from time to time and picking up your thoughts. Do please support the appeal, which if we get the museum's appeal, which if we get our editing right, should appear under me as I speak these words. Thank you for watching, and join us again for another of these Friends presentations.